Lesson 2, the New Deal. A new president. The Depression got worse in 1932. It was a presidential election year, and the Democrats chose Franklin Delano Roosevelt, governor of New York, as their candidate. Northwesterners were unsure of Roosevelt's views, but they were anxious for a change. FDR, as he was called, won the election. He promised a new deal for the American people. Alphabet soup. FDR's New Deal created jobs to put people back to work. Many job programs were started. So many, in fact, that the programs were referred to as alphabet soup, since most people identified them by their abbreviations. One of the most popular programs was the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. Young men from every part of the nation were stationed in camps throughout the country. There were more than 200 camps in the Northwest. The men earned from $30 to $45 a month and received good food, education, and discipline. CCC camps were commanded by Army officers. The program helped the young men of the CCC and their families too. Each CCC worker was required to send $25 home to their families each month. Young men worked on soil conservation projects, provided labor at fish hatcheries and wildlife refuges, planted millions of trees on public lands, and fought forest fires. CCC workers also blazed trails in many state and national parks, including trails in the Grand Canyon in Arizona. They built the headquarters site for the Olympic National Park right here in our state. An Indian division of the CCC, with headquarters in Spokane, worked on Indian reservations. They built trails, roads, and forest fire lookout towers. Work for everyone. There were also hundreds of smaller construction jobs funded by the New Deal. These provided much needed employment. Workers built highways, bridges, school buildings, libraries, post offices, parks, sewers, and water systems. One of the most well-known New Deal programs was the Workers' Progress Administration, or the WPA. In addition to hiring people for construction work, the WPA hired musicians, writers, historians, and artists. One of the WPA's most important projects was a collection of interviews with former slaves. Journalists traveled all over the country to speak with and record interviews with former slaves. Also, histories of cities and states were written and published. Public buildings received a facelift. The WPA also hired artists to paint murals on the walls of libraries, hospitals, and government buildings. The work of the WPA can be seen in Washington and around the country. In King County, for example, WPA projects included improvements to the King County Airport, road construction in Auburn, Seattle, Mercer Island, and Vashon Island, construction of the Issaquah Fish Hatchery, as well as the Duval Library, the Renton Fire Station, and Bothell City Hall. New construction improvements and additions to many schools, housework and child care services, reader services for the elderly and for the blind, public arts projects, including murals and sculptures in post offices, libraries, and hospitals, to name just a few. A New Deal for the Pacific Northwest. President Roosevelt viewed the Pacific Northwest, with its small population and abundant natural resources, as a last frontier of undeveloped places. He wanted people to use forests and rivers wisely. He was also willing to use federal money to help them. Federal money comes from the national government. Now let's read about one of these federal-funded projects, the Grand Coulee Dam. The biggest New Deal project in Washington was the construction of the Grand Coulee Dam. As you read in Chapter 6, the campaign to build a dam on the Columbia River began in the 1920s. The Columbia Basin region was a hot and dry region. Early explorers called it the Great Columbia Desert. This arid region was made worse during the Great Depression by a drought that created a dust bowl like the one in the Great Plains states. At one point, a windstorm created a cloud of dust rising thousands of feet in the air. The dust swept across Washington to the Pacific Ocean. It was reported that the huge cloud of dust completely surrounded an ocean liner 600 miles off the coast of Seattle. The severe drought and high unemployment led to the approval of the Columbia Basin Reclamation Project. The project would include several other dams. President Roosevelt thought large-scale public works projects would provide immediate jobs for many of the destitute or needy Dust Bowl immigrants. Construction on the dam began in 1933 and was finished in 1941. Jobs for thousands. More than 12,000 workers were hired during the time it took to build the dam. The pay was good by Great Depression standards, and the average pay for unskilled labor was 85 cents an hour. Skilled workers could make up to $1.20 an hour. However, the work was not steady and could be very dangerous. More than 70 workers died on the job, mostly from falling or from having something fall on them. There were frequent work shutdowns due to scheduling or cold weather. Although most of the workers were white, the project did employ blacks and Native Americans from the nearby Colville Reservation. The dam, which has been called the eighth wonder of the world and the mightiest thing ever built by man, was the largest concrete structure in the world. The reservoir created by the dam stretches 150 miles long and produces more electric power than any other dam in the United States. A reservoir is a natural or artificial pond or lake used for storage and control of water. Journalists covering this grand project described what they saw. It will contain enough concrete to build a highway from Philadelphia to Seattle and back. Enough water will flow through the dam each year to provide New York City's drinking water for 100 years. A surprising feature is the number of young men employed at Grand Coulee. I noticed dozens of tall lads wearing football jerseys from nearby universities. The work is dangerous, and scarcely a day passes without someone being injured. 54 men have already been killed. The cost of progress. Construction of the Grand Coulee Dam created thousands of jobs. It also brought water to dry land and cheap electricity to the region and provided flood control on the Columbia River. However, this progress came at a high price. Between 3,000 and 4,000 people were forced out of their homes to make way for the dam. Their homes and farms were located in areas flooded by the dam. The dam turned out to have devastating consequences for Native Americans. Construction of the dam submerged ancient villages, fishing spots, and burial grounds. Tribes were relocated once again. Most devastating, however, was the impact on the salmon fishing. The Grand Coulee Dam destroyed wild salmon runs on the upper Columbia River. A way of life for many of the Indian tribes in the region came to an end. Victory for labor. Despite the progress made by many New Deal programs in creating jobs, many workers still suffered. Wages were low, work hours were long, and conditions were still dangerous for many workers. Many workers thought the New Deal had not done enough. They wanted more. They got their wish with the passage of the National Labor Relations Act. The law, also known as the Wagner Act, guaranteed workers the right to join unions and organize strikes. It would now be against the law for an employer to prevent workers from organizing or to punish them when they did. The law gave workers a place at the bargaining table when wages, hours, and working conditions were negotiated. The law was a major victory for the nation's workers. As a result, more workers joined unions. The clash of unions. While the new law helped increase union membership, it also fueled a growing feud between rival labor unions. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, was a union of skilled workers that had been around since the 1880s. Its members included carpenters, electricians, meat cutters, and teamsters or truck drivers. AFL leaders believed that unions with only skilled workers had more bargaining power than unions with unskilled workers. But by the mid-1930s, a lot of workers wanted all workers to be in one big union. When they couldn't get the AFL to open up their membership, these workers split and formed the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO. The feud was on. Before the AFL and CIO fought repeated battles over who should represent workers, goon squads or groups of paid thugs that were on both sides of the dispute. Baseball bats, cargo hooks were often used as weapons when these two groups confronted one another. Lumber mills, breweries, warehouses, and shipping docks were centers for conflict. Newspapers took sides. Washington became one of the most unionized states in the nation. In Seattle, the AFL Teamsters Union clashed with the CIO's longshoremen and warehouse unions. Longshoremen load and unload ships. It was hard work, and the men worked long hours. Warehousemen worked in huge warehouses where goods were stored until they could be transported to other places. The warehouses were freezing cold in the winter and very hot in the summer. In spring 1939, the two unions clashed over who had the right to represent workers in the salmon canning industry. Workers slugged it out with fists, knives, and rocks, according to the newspaper reports. Rocks were flying in all directions, reported the Seattle Daily Times. 4 men were taken to the hospital with serious injuries, and police arrested 6 others. Despite the bitter rivalry, the two unions eventually merged in the 1950s. Native Americans get a new deal. Indian populations reached their lowest level in the early 1900s. Poor diets and poor living conditions contributed to high death rates, especially among children. A new wave of diseases, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and influenza ravaged the reservations. And alcoholism was a big problem. A Columbia University anthropologist, John Collier, was appointed to lead the Bureau of Indian Affairs. An anthropologist studies human societies and cultures. Collier believed that the whole concept of the Dawes Act to Americanize the Indians had been a huge mistake. He thought that breaking up tribes was wrong. The tribe upheld the social morale and spiritual values of the group. The Indian Reorganization Act repealed the Dawes Act and encouraged tribal governments. Tribes would again have common land and would promote Indian languages, arts, crafts, and ceremonies. Native Americans in Washington, however, did not immediately benefit from this new law. Many Native Americans in Puget Sound had married outside of their tribes and made their living from industries like fishing and logging rather than farming on a reservation. And as a result, they did not all have the tribal identities that the law attempted to preserve. The worst was over. By 1939, the worst of the Great Depression was over. Slowly, businesses opened up again. Unemployment was still high, but many people were working. They started to purchase goods. They could afford to buy more meat and other foods, so farmers made more money. Industry and trade in the Pacific Northwest also improved. World War II ended, what was left of the Great Depression. Similar to World War I, the fighting started in Europe. At first, the United States tried not to get involved. However, staying out of the war became increasingly difficult. And that will be the topic of Lesson 3.